What if everything you were taught about the dawn of the modern world is a carefully constructed lie? Observe the magnificent architecture of our oldest cities. We are told these towering domes and gilded spires were merely aesthetic, built in an era of horses, but a growing movement believes they are the surviving remnants of a suppressed global civilization. They propose a forgotten empire engineered entire cities to pull limitless, free energy directly from the sky. Did early industrialists deliberately destroy a utopian energy grid just to force a billing meter onto your living room wall? The sky's untapped battery. Look up at the horizon and imagine the sky not as an empty void, but as a colossal, invisible battery. For decades, the fringes of history have hummed with stories of a lost empire that supposedly mastered the very air to fuel its cities. These theories about a global etheric grid might sound like pure science fiction, but they are rooted in a physics reality that is far more surprising than the legends suggest. Our planet is essentially a giant spherical capacitor. High above us, the ionosphere serves as a conductive upper plate, maintaining a staggering electrical potential of 400,000 volts relative to the ground. As you stand outside, you are actually walking through a vertical electric field that drops by between 100 and 150 volts for every single meter of height. On paper, it seems like we are swimming in an ocean of free energy, just waiting for a tall enough conductor to reach up and drink from the heavens. The romantic vision of a world powered for free begins to fracture when we look at the numbers that define our atmosphere. While the voltage in the sky is immense, the actual flow of electricity, known as the conduction current density, is almost non-existent. We are talking about roughly 2 picoamperes per square meter. To grasp how tiny that is, imagine trying to fill a swimming pool using only the moisture from a single human breath. The entire atmosphere of our planet acts as a massive bottleneck with a global resistance of about 200 ohms. This resistance is a physical guardrail that prevents the sky from discharging all its energy at once, ensuring that the fair weather sky remains a quiet, low-energy environment. This does not mean the technology to harvest this energy is a myth. Modern science has actually achieved this by using carbon nanomaterials like graphene to pull power directly from airborne ions. These specialized collectors utilize the corona effect, where electric fields intensify at sharp conductive points according to the mathematical principles of Poisson's equation. This phenomenon allows us to trick the atmosphere into surrendering its charge, and we can indeed tap into the atmospheric circuit. However, the law of conservation of energy dictates that we cannot create power from nothing. The energy in our sky is a direct result of work performed by the sun, which constantly ionizes our air. To bridge the gap from a laboratory experiment to a citywide power grid, we would need to abandon the calm of fair weather. A single light bulb might flicker to life from the ambient air, but to power a civilization, we would need the concentrated energy of a perpetual, global thunderstorm. The dream of the old world was not a suppressed miracle of free energy, but a misunderstood glimpse of a planetary machine that values balance over abundance. The myth of Mayor Grant. You would think the mayor of New York had lost his mind. In the vibrant fringes of alternative history, the story goes that in 1889, Mayor Hugh J. Grant issued a sweeping authoritarian decree to violently dismantle a fully operational free energy system. Theorists passionately point to an alleged, mysteriously misfiled library report titled Atmospheric Charge Collection Systems as absolute proof that Manhattan roofs were once proudly crowned with tall copper rods and vast capacitor banks, all silently pulling unlimited electricity directly from the open sky. The compelling narrative claims that Grant, acting as a ruthless enforcer for greedy early industrialists, ordered this magnificent, harmonious grid, destroyed and permanently sealed the evidence away. They argue he deliberately suppressed a utopian atmospheric technology just so centralized power monopolies could eventually put a meter on your wall and financially exploit every single citizen. To comprehend the true nature of that infamous mayoral decree, We must step completely out of the realm of suppressed miracles and directly into the terrifying, chaotic skies of the Gilded Age. New York City in 1889 was absolute ground zero for the notorious War of Currents, a brutal, high-stakes corporate battle between the direct current systems of Thomas Edison and the alternating current championed by George Westinghouse. The city was absolutely not a serene, highly advanced landscape of etheric antennas. Instead, the skies of Manhattan were heavily draped in a suffocating, terrifying web of overhead wires. Tens of thousands of poorly insulated high-voltage cables indiscriminately crisscrossed the busy streets in dense, chaotic spiderweb, like arrays that literally blocked out the sun. These thick bundles of metal were not elegant, passive energy collectors. They were heavily exposed, highly lethal conduits carrying raw, fiercely experimental power directly over the heads of millions of completely unsuspecting pedestrians. The ultimate breaking point was not a grand conspiracy to steal power from the people, but rather a horrifying series of high-profile, utterly gruesome public electrocutions. Maintenance linemen were literally dying on the wooden poles, their bodies caught and suspended in the tangled, sparking mess of live alternating current wires for all the horrified city below to witness. Mayor Grant did not issue his sweeping decree to hide free energy from the masses. He issued a desperate, uncompromising public safety mandate to physically chop down the deadly overhead lines and forcibly shift the entire electrification of New York down into protective underground conduits. This massive, safety-driven infrastructural shift literally caused the visible overhead grid to vanish almost overnight. The heavily congested sky suddenly cleared, leaving only the sturdy, monumental architecture of the era standing beautifully bare against the open horizon. Modern theorists look at historical photographs from this exact transitional period, see booming cities suddenly stripped of their highly visible power lines, and mistakenly interpret this dramatic aesthetic reset as the deliberate burial of ancient, advanced technology. What they perceive as the tragic erasure of a glorious global energy empire was actually the frantic, fundamentally necessary burial of a completely modern, entirely terrifying industrial hazard. The fall of Wardenclyffe Tower. Think about this for a second. If Nikola Tesla was simply unearthing ancient Tartarian tech, why was he drowning in hotel debt? From 1901 to 1917, Wardenclyffe was not a magical, effortless resurrection of lost etheric sciences. It was a massive, brutal, deeply terrestrial engineering undertaking. The scale of construction was physically staggering. We are talking about a 187-foot tower constructed entirely of thick pine timbers, specifically chosen for their insulating properties. It was topped by a massive 55-ton metallic cupola designed to accumulate immense electrical charge. But the structure went just as deep underground. Tesla drove a 120-foot subsurface shaft lined with wood and steel, pushing 16 iron pipes 300 feet into the bedrock to physically grip the earth. Adjacent to this massive wooden giant stood a beautiful brick laboratory designed by the famous architect Stanford White, which housed a roaring 200-kilowatt Westinghouse alternating current industrial generator. This was not a passive antenna catching whispers from the sky. It was a heavy, deafening, smoke-belching industrial plant requiring immense mechanical force. Modern folklore insists that the legendary financier J.P. Morgan maliciously suppressed Wardenclyffe the moment he realized free power could not be metered for. Profit. The historical ledgers tell a much colder, vastly more pragmatic story of early venture capitalism. Morgan originally gave Tesla $150,000 with a very specific, fiercely competitive goal. He wanted a wireless telegraphy station capable of beating Guglielmo Marconi in the race to send a message across the Atlantic. Morgan was investing in global communications, not a utopian global power grid. When Tesla abruptly shifted his focus and secretly diverted those funds to pursue his grand vision of wireless power transmission, he broke his contract. As the financial panics of the early 20th century set in, Tesla desperately returned to Morgan, asking for more capital to finish his giant machine. Morgan simply refused. He had already paid for a radio, and Marconi had just successfully transmitted the first transatlantic signal. The money printer was shut off. Without his billionaire backer, Tesla watched his personal finances absolutely collapse. His highly lucrative alternating current patents had expired by 1905, completely drying up his primary royalty stream. To keep up appearances and maintain his laboratory, he survived on massive lines of credit. Eventually, to cover his absolutely crushing debt at the luxurious Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Tesla was forced into a humiliating corner. He signed the deed for the entire Wardenclyffe property over to the hotel proprietor, George C. Bolt. The grand vision did not end in a shadowy government raid or a dramatic cover-up. In 1917, Bolt contracted the Smiley Steel Company to literally dynamite the Great Pine Tower to pieces. They blew it up to sell the wreckage as raw scrap metal just to recoup a meager $20,000 hotel bill. The great machine fell not because it threatened the fabric of the energy industry, but because its creator simply could not pay rent. Decoding the radiant energy patent. Did Tesla actually admit in writing that free energy was a suppressed ancient science? To theorists investigating the lost empire, his 1901 patent, method of utilizing radiant energy, is often presented as the ultimate smoking gun. The contention centers entirely around a specific phrase where Tesla supposedly confesses that the principles of gathering limitless power from the sky were long known and practically applied by those who came before him. When we forensically examine the original document, however, this highly publicized claim completely unravels. The phrase "long known" does not exist anywhere in the text of Patent 6.85958. Tesla actually wrote the words "well known," and the context of that specific phrasing fundamentally changes the entire meaning of his invention. Tesla was not gesturing toward a buried global utopia. He was directly referencing the rapidly evolving, heavily documented scientific consensus of the early 20th century. During this exact period, physicists were newly obsessed with understanding certain types of invisible energy, specifically the ionizing properties of ultraviolet light, cathodic rays, and Röntgen rays. It was a well-known, established fact among his peer group that these newly discovered radiations possessed the unique property of charging and discharging conductors of electricity. Furthermore, it was an accepted scientific baseline that higher altitudes carried a positive atmospheric charge while the ground held a negative charge. Tesla was simply stating the current facts of physics before introducing his highly novel way to exploit them. His actual breakthrough in this patent was not uncovering a city-wide power grid, but designing a highly specific, small-scale apparatus. He proposed using a carefully insulated metal plate elevated in the air to capture these ambient radiations. Because the ambient charge in the atmosphere is incredibly weak, he connected this elevated plate to a condenser. This component acted as a critical electrical reservoir, painstakingly accumulating that microscopic trickle of energy over a long period of time until it gathered enough force to produce a single, powerful discharge capable of operating small mechanical devices. When you strip away the layers of modern mythology, the historical reality is far more fascinating. Tesla was not acting as an archaeologist for a forgotten era. He was operating at the absolute cutting edge of material science. He was filing a patent for a brilliant early precursor to what we now understand as the modern solar cell and the cosmic ray detector. This was a masterclass in manipulating physics on a strict micro-energy scale. It was a highly sensitive method for harvesting the quiet background radiation of the universe, absolutely not a suppressed architectural blueprint for powering massive metropolitan grids. The White City Power Myth. Imagine standing in the blinding, unprecedented glow of the 1893 Chicago World Fair. For the first time in human history, an entire metropolis was brilliantly illuminated against the night sky, creating a breathtaking spectacle known as the White City. Today, a persistent theory claims that the immense power required for this grand display simply does not add up on paper. Theorists argue there is a mysterious, unexplained gap of 2.5 megawatts, suggesting this massive electrical deficit was secretly supplemented by ancient atmospheric energy collectors built directly into the grand architecture. The historical engineering records reveal a much more cutthroat and terrestrial reality. The fair was the ultimate battleground for corporate supremacy, and George Westinghouse won the bid to light the grounds by savagely undercutting General Electric by more than $1 million. He did not achieve this through etheric magic, but through brute industrial force. If you walked into the massive hall of machinery, you would not find silent, glowing crystals. You would feel the ground shaking beneath 12 thunderous 1,000 horsepower alternating current generators. Together, these massive iron beasts pumped out roughly 9 megawatts of total peak capacity to successfully electrify the exposition. That supposed missing 2.5 megawatts of power was simply the result of profound, early electrical inefficiency. Westinghouse faced a massive legal hurdle because he could not legally use the reliable sealed glass bulbs patented by his rival Thomas Edison. To get around this strict limitation, his engineers deployed a controversial workaround called stopper lamps. These alternative bulbs were incredibly fragile, wildly inefficient, and they burned out at an astonishing rate. To keep the fair shining beautifully, Westinghouse had to employ a literal small army of workers who frantically patrolled the vast grounds every single night, constantly replacing a staggering lighting load of roughly 100,000 failing incandescent lamps. The massive amounts of energy were not mysteriously disappearing into thin air. They were simply being wasted as raw heat and friction in a revolutionary prototype system pushed to its absolute limits. When the fair closed after just 6 months, the breathtaking neoclassical buildings were promptly demolished, leading modern theorists to loudly cry, "Cover up." They see the sudden destruction of a glorious ancient capital. The reality of civil engineering is much less romantic. The entire sprawling metropolis was essentially a giant theatrical set built from a cheap, highly flammable mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber known as staff. It was designed to beautifully mimic solid marble from a distance, but was never structurally intended to survive a brutal Chicago winter. The prompt, highly publicized demolition of these magnificent structures was a standard public safety measure to quickly clear away thousands of tons of rotting, heavily fire-prone plaster, not a deliberate erasure of suppressed global technology. Deconstructing the ancient power station. Look up at the skyline and ask yourself a simple question. Why would the builders of the Gilded Age go to the staggering expense of covering a majestic architectural dome in pure gold or solid copper, if not to conduct electricity? For proponents of the lost empire, these gleaming metallic roofs are the ultimate proof of a global, ancient power grid serving as massive conductive antennas designed to pull atmospheric charge directly from the heavens. The actual engineering records of the 19th century reveal a reality driven entirely by brutal economics and architectural survival rather than esoteric energy harvesting. Building a skyscraper or a massive cathedral is an incredibly expensive investment, and copper provides an unparalleled defense against the elements. Over time, it forms a protective oxide patina that aggressively resists corrosion for centuries, making it far more cost-effective than asphalt or lead over the life cycle of a monument. Furthermore, these towering spires and domes are notoriously difficult to access for regular maintenance. Copper requires absolutely no cleaning and resists the physical creep associated with softer roofing metals. While it is incredibly conductive, its primary electrical function in these grand structures was entirely protective. It acted as a massive lightning rod, catching sudden destructive atmospheric discharges and driving that lethal energy harmlessly into the earth to prevent catastrophic fires, rather than actively harvesting it for municipal power. The narrative of the ancient power station also relies heavily on mysterious internal components. specifically the highly mythologized concepts of red mercury and resonant quartz oscillators. To find the true origin of these terms, we have to examine the incredibly dirty, fiercely experimental industrial laboratories of 1902. This was the year inventor Peter Cooper Hewitt introduced the rapidly electrifying world to mercury arc rectifiers. These were not ancient magical relics, but rather large, evacuated glass bulbs containing pools of liquid mercury used to convert high-voltage alternating current into direct current. The workers and engineers dealing with early mercury vapor lamps faced a highly specific problem, as the arcs produced a notoriously harsh, ghastly green light that made everything around them look completely unnatural. To fix this terrible aesthetic issue, engineers designed specific transformers to artificially introduce red rays of light into the spectrum, attempting to mimic the warm, comfortable glow of traditional incandescent bulbs. This highly practical, completely documented color correction process is the mundane origin of the legendary red mercury nomenclature. Similarly, quartz was heavily utilized alongside these exact systems, not because it possessed some mystical capability to draw invisible energy from the surrounding environment. Engineers relied on quartz because it is an exceptional electrical insulator, fully capable of withstanding the immense, blistering heat generated by early man-made electrical arcs. The supposedly lost components of a grand etheric machine turn out to be the gritty, thermodynamic building blocks of our own early modern industry, completely divorced from any ancient, esoteric energy fields. Debunking the mud flood. Are the half-buried ground floors of our oldest cities proof of a mid-19th century cataclysm? For those who believe in a grand historical reset, these strange subterranean windows and sunken doorways serve as the ultimate smoking gun. They propose that a terrifying global tsunami of silt and debris swept across the continents, violently burying the glorious, advanced architecture of a forgotten civilization and creating the modern street levels we walk on today. It is a highly evocative theory, but the actual explanation buried beneath our pavement is a magnificent story of colossal, sweaty human engineering, rather than a planetary apocalypse. To understand why so many Gilded Age buildings appear to have sunk into the earth, we have to examine the horrific sanitation crises of the 19th century. As urban populations exploded, cities built on low-lying terrain, such as Chicago and Seattle, found themselves drowning in their own waste because they simply lacked the elevation for proper drainage. Instead of abandoning these booming commercial centers, engineers decided to physically lift the cities into the sky. In an unparalleled display of coordinated labor, massive teams of workers descended into the muck, placing millions of individual hand-turned jack screws beneath entire city blocks. With astonishing precision, they literally cranked heavy brick hotels, sprawling mansions, and bustling storefronts several feet into the air. While these massive structures hovered above the swamp, laborers constructed robust, modern sewer systems underneath them, and then brought in tons of fresh dirt to build an entirely new, elevated street grade. Through this massive infrastructural overhaul, what was once a sunny first floor was permanently swallowed by the new pavement, instantly becoming a dark basement. Even in cities that did not raise their streets, half-buried windows were an absolute architectural necessity. Before the era of the incandescent light bulb, designing a usable subterranean space was incredibly difficult. The standard practice was to dig specialized light wells directly adjacent to the foundation. These sunken shafts were purposefully built to capture natural sunlight and channel crucial fresh air down into the lower levels of heavy masonry buildings. When modern repair crews dig below the sidewalk and uncover incredibly rough, jagged brickwork, theorists often mistake this for the ruined, forgotten tops of ancient palaces. In reality, they are looking at standard, highly utilitarian foundation work. Master architects never intended for the public eye to see below the soil line, so builders deliberately used cheaper materials and crude techniques to save money where aesthetics did not matter. We are not walking over the buried ashes of a lost empire. We are standing on top of the incredibly pragmatic, desperately needed public works projects of early modern sanitation workers. The economics of energy control. The grand suppression of free energy did not require secret mayoral decrees or shadow governments plotting to hide ancient magical technology from the masses. It required something far more terrestrial and unyielding, the cold, calculating logic of the robber barons. To truly understand why the grid looks the way it does today, we have to strip away the modern mythology of suppressed utopian empires and dive headfirst into the harsh, unforgiving financial reality of the Gilded Age. When we examine the ledgers and letters of this pivotal era, we do not find men like J.P. Morgan acting as cartoon villains, desperate to bury the glowing relics of a lost civilization. Instead, we see the absolute apex predators of early modern finance, operating essentially as the very first ruthless venture capitalists of the industrial age. These elite industrialists built their massive empires on tangible, controllable assets, not esoteric atmospheric fields. At the very dawn of urban electrification, cities were a messy patchwork of small, isolated power plants, dedicated to running single factories or illuminating individual city blocks. This highly fragmented system was chaotic, incredibly expensive to maintain, and woefully inadequate for the booming demands of rapidly expanding metropolises. The aggressive transition away from these local generators toward massive, centralized, alternating current grids was not a sinister conspiracy to steal abundant power from the people. It was a brutal, pragmatic economic necessity. Centralization was the only mathematically and scientifically viable way to generate immense, reliable wattage and push it efficiently across hundreds of miles of wire to feed a hungry, industrializing nation. More importantly, this centralized distribution model allowed the titans of industry to do the one thing they cared about most: attach a reliable billing meter to the final output. The entire emerging business model of the 20th century relied on the strict ability to scale, distribute, and sell energy as a highly controlled, deeply profitable commodity. Nikola Tesla possessed a brilliant, genuinely radical dream of tapping into the resonant frequencies of the planet to provide wireless power to the entire globe. That beautiful dream did not perish because he accidentally rediscovered forbidden Tartarian magic that threatened the hidden rulers of the world. It died a slow, highly documented financial death because an unmetered, universally accessible power grid could never attract the staggering venture capital required to actually construct it. In an era defined by brutal financial panics, cutthroat corporate warfare, and relentless monopolistic consolidation, an invention that could not be easily monetized simply could not survive the boardroom. We do not live in the buried ruins of a suppressed, free energy utopia.